Good morning, Wingmen out there. Welcome to Wingman Men's Moments Podcast with me, Randy Ferreira, and Pastor Jay Dennis. Good morning, Pastor Jay.
Good morning, buddy. It's good to see you.
Me too. We are the co-founders of Wingman Nation and City Central Church in Lakeland, Florida. We're Christian men, we're husbands, we're fathers, we're grandfathers, and we have a passion to help men become better husbands, better dads, and more godly and Christ-like men.
That's right.
So, Pastor Jay, take it away.
Amen. Well, we're going to look at an interesting subject today entitled, Pharaoh, There's a Frog in Our Oven. And so we want to go to the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. So I'm going to be reading out of the New Living Translation, which is a great translation to put it in more modern language.
Right.
So we'll be using that. Let's listen to the backstory here. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go back to Pharaoh and announce to him, 'This is what the Lord says, let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs across your entire land. The Nile River will swarm with frogs. They will come up out of the river and into your palace, even into your bedroom and onto your bed. They will enter the houses of your officials and your people. They will even jump into your ovens and your kneading bowls. Frogs will jump on you, your people, and all your officials.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron, raise the staff in your hand over all the rivers, canals, and ponds of Egypt, and bring up frogs over all the land.' So Aaron raised up his hand over the waters of Egypt, and frogs came up and covered the whole land. But the magicians were able to do the same thing with their magic. They too caused frogs to come up on the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, and begged, plead with the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people. I will let your people go so they can offer sacrifices to the Lord.' 'You set the time,' Moses replied. 'Tell me when you want me to pray for you, your officials, and your people. Then you and your houses will be rid of the frogs. They will remain only in the Nile River. Do it tomorrow,' Pharaoh said. 'All right,' Moses replied. 'It will be as you have said. Then you will know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials and your people. They will remain only in the Nile River.' So Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's palace, and Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had inflicted on Pharaoh. And the Lord did just what Moses had predicted. The frogs in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields all died. The Egyptians piled them into great heaps, and a terrible stench, can you imagine this? A terrible stench filled the land. But when Pharaoh saw that relief had come, he became stubborn, and he refused to listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had predicted. So today we're actually going to give you a frog test to determine if you have frog problems. Now, God had sent Moses to Egypt to deliver and rescue his people. Pharaoh absolutely refused to budge and would not let them go. Now, there would be a series of plagues that would visit the land as a result of Pharaoh mocking God. The plagues are water turning to blood, that had already happened, frogs, lice, flies, livestock pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the killing of firstborn children. What a mess.
What a mess. And that reminds me, you don't mock God.
You do not.
And we talked about that with the Olympic Committee and the introduction there
That's
that they did, mocking of God. And so we're just sitting back waiting to see what God's going to do with that. But today, like you said, we're going to want to zero in on the plague of frogs. What a mess. It sounds, when you read that, it's one thing, but when you hear it out loud, it is really nasty. I mean, you start imagining it more in your head, and it's like, Can you just imagine that? Frogs in the oven, frogs in the dough. It said kneading in the dough. I mean, it's like, oh goodness.
Wow.
And I hate frogs, especially the Florida frogs. I don't know how familiar our
they're
listeners
evil.
are with Florida frogs.
They're evil.
Some of these Florida frogs came from South America, and they've got big suckers on their feet and their hands.
Yeah.
And they're white and nasty, and oh my goodness.
Yes.
They jump on your face and suck the side of your face. It's like a horror movie.
One slipped into our house the other night, and I nearly just couldn't catch him. He was hiding from me. So at 2 a.m., I see this hopping in our living room, and then I remembered I didn't deal with the frog. Better deal with the frogs.
Oh, gosh, yeah. You know, we have just a sidebar. We have a neighbor lady down the street, a retired lady, and she absolutely hates these frogs. They're white, and they came from South America. She says they're poisonous to dogs if they eat them and different things. So she said they're useless, and we just need to kill them.
Yes.
Right? So she has a special frog hammer, and she goes out at night waiting for the frogs, and then she uses the hammer to track them down and kill them.
She is passionate.
She is passionate. Right, she's got the frog hammer. So she's the hammer lady.
Oh, man.
All right, so here's the frog test. This will determine if you have a frog problem.
Right.
So ready? Here we go. See if you can fill in these blanks. I'm ready to throw in the blank. I'm at the end of I'm just a bundle of. My life is falling. I'm at my wits. I feel like resigning from the human. So if you answered, throw in the towel, at the end of my rope, just a bundle of nerves, my life's falling apart, I'm at the end of we already said that, and I'm at my wits' end, and I feel like I'm resigning from the human race, then you need this podcast.
You need frog help.
You need frog help. So as you were saying, Moses told Pharaoh of the coming plagues, and he refused to obey God.
Right.
And yet, he wouldn't budge an inch, right? Already, the Nile River had turned to blood, as you said. But again, that didn't move Pharaoh at all. I can't imagine. You're seeing God right before you and turning the river into blood. Hello.
Yes. Come on.
So now I enter the frogs. Here a frog, there a frog, everywhere, and these frogs were everywhere. Here a frog, there a frog, right? So they were on the streets, they were in the houses, they were in cabinets, if you can imagine. Frogs everywhere. They would even open an oven door, as I said earlier, and they'd hear a croak. There'd be frogs in the oven. In the beds, can you imagine getting in bed at night? And I just can't even fathom that, but... Frogs on your back, frogs under your feet, squishing them as you walk, slipping and sliding everywhere. Disgusting, right? So when they slid into their bed, as we said, their feet, can you imagine your feet in the sheets?
Man.
You got it? Frogs. You're getting the picture here, right?
Yes.
Frogs in the shower, in their hair. I mean, it was truly riveting. So let's consider this passage and some practical applications to the passage. So number one, identifying frogs that you may be facing. So we're not picking on these slimy creatures. You know, I don't like frogs.
Yeah.
They're disgusting, and I don't even like touching them. I have to put gloves on.
I won't even eat frog legs, man.
Some places see them as delicacies, like you said. But we don't have anything against Kermit. I like Kermit, Miss Piggy, right? But you got to admit that in Egypt, these frogs became real problems.
They did.
Real problems. Egypt became the frog central. It was something they couldn't ignore, and they had to deal with it. It's just hard to imagine, but frogs, just think about it. Frogs everywhere. I think it happened, too, when they were sleeping and they woke up to it. But hopping and croaking, and some other way, in some ways we all deal with our frogs, right? I mean,
we really do, and that's what we're trying to do, is just identify these frogs.
Yeah, and your frogs may be problems. Our frogs may be problems. Problems that suddenly show up out of nowhere, like the frogs did, and suddenly they're everywhere, right?
Yep.
So there's no escaping them, no ignoring these problems that show up, like the frogs. So it's like the man who went to the airport and demanded, "I want a ticket, and I want it now." But, sir, where do you want a ticket to? He said, "Ma'am, it doesn't matter. I've got problems everywhere."
Boy, I've had days like that, haven't you?
Yes, it's just... So if you have a pulse, you have a problem. There's no
right.
question. Even God's people in Egypt were having to deal with frogs too, right? So Christians aren't exempt from problems or from the frogs, and sometimes they have nothing to do with it. Sometimes you may have brought it on ourselves by disobedience.
Exactly.
It's a consequence of disobedience. That happens, right?
I think about the people of Israel. They had not disobeyed God in that setting, but they were having to deal with the consequences of Pharaoh disobeying God. So sometimes it's not about us. Sometimes it's the consequence of someone else's sin, but sometimes it is our sin. Sometimes we do bring it on.
And many times you don't realize that you are going to have to suffer consequences from your actions of disobedience.
It's true.
It's scriptural. God says that. It may not be immediately when you disobey or don't do what you're supposed to do, but those consequences will come.
No doubt about it. So your frog may be problems, but number two, your frogs may be people. Maybe you feel like you're surrounded by a bunch of frogs. Perhaps there are those who are croaking about how bad things are for them or what's wrong with the world. You know people like that. I know people like that.
And if you don't know anybody like that, you may be the frog.
You may be the frog. Yeah, maybe it's the place you work or the people you work with. You may even live with a frog.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. All right, guys. One dad said when our older daughter was a child in elementary school, one day she came storming into the house, stomped into her room, slammed that door, all the while muttering under her breath, "People, people, people." Thinking I might be of some help, I tapped on the door and asked, "May I come in?" And the answer was an explosive no. "Why?" I asked. She said, "Because you're a people."
You're a people too.
So sometimes people are our frogs. But your frogs, number three, may be consequences that we talked about earlier. In Egypt, these frogs were the consequences of Pharaoh saying no to God and leaving God out. This is a picture of life without God. The frogs were the result of a wrong, sinful choice. You can say no to God, but not without consequences. Many times people end up in the midst of a mess, not because God did it, but because of their wrong choices. You can't leave God out and avoid the frogs.
Right.
There are marriages facing frogs because God has not been included. God's marriage manual, the Bible, was never consulted or practiced. There are families that are facing frogs because God was left out. His principles were ignored. You can't have godly, moral children by accident. So bad decisions, wrong choices, frogs. So you've got to identify the frogs first. But share number two with us, my friend.
So number two is Satan can add to the problem, but only God can remove the frogs, and we talked about this. So let's look at Exodus 8:7. But the magicians were able to do the same thing with their magic. They too caused frogs to come up on the land of Egypt.
Right.
And you may think, well, how can a magician do that? Well, one, obviously God allowed that to happen.
He did.
And two, Satan does have power.
He does.
Evil spirits can do things that are surprising to all of us, so we have to recognize this. But
that's right.
But these magicians, they brought on more frogs. Already frogs were coming out of their ears, right? And yet magicians of Satan would bring on more frogs. Take that. That'll fix you, they said. They proved a point, but they made it worse.
They did.
So Satan he can add to the problem, through his power. Like we said, they did make more frogs appear. So Satan always has a limitation of God's real thing, is a counterfeit.
Right.
As we said, God allows it, but it's God's real thing. But this experience gave them a false sense of hope, right? Because they thought, well, we're magicians, we can do that too. So there's not really a God. And Satan could produce experiences that feel like that, and there are counterfeit preachers out there, and teachers out there of the Bible, and we got to be very careful about that.
We do, and Satan always wants to bring an imitation of God's real thing, and that can even happen with salvation. is that there are counterfeit salvation experiences where a person maybe thought he or she were saved, but they never really met Jesus.
Yeah, and here's something really important. Just notice this. Although they could make the frogs appear due to the power of Satan and the evil spirits, they could not remove the problem. God was in control.
That's right.
And that's how we have to look at it. Mm-hmm. We're gonna fall to these frogs and consequences, but the problem's not going to go away.
No.
Until God decides and we surrender that. So
that's right.
And there's one thing we can't do, Satan can't do, nobody can do, and that is remove the frogs, as I just said. Remove the sin that separates you from God. It took the intervention of God to finally remove the frogs, and that's what it will take in our lives.
Exactly.
God has to intervene, and we have to let him in to intervene.
Right.
And then he will take away the consequences.
He will.
And it takes an intervention of God at the time and place of our life that we decide to allow him to do that. We invite him in to do that. So we receive him. He comes in. We remove that wall between us that sin creates from God, and then he will come in. So if you're a Christian and you have unconfessed sin in your life, it too will take an intervention of God. You have to still do it. You have to confess the sin and give him the absolute control of your life.
No doubt about it.
To bring down that wall.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. And as you listen to this, if you take this away, don't wait till tomorrow to do what God says to do today. We want you to share this with other men. We want you to share this with your family. Tell other people about our podcast, because this will help you to grow spiritually. So take the time to listen and, more importantly, to act on what you've heard.
Hop on it right now.
Hop on it. Excellent. Excellent. Well, until the next time.
Wingman out.